When I started shooting interviews, my setups often either looked too flat or too staged. It took time, but I learned the tricks of getting that authentic documentary style lighting that makes your subject look their best and keeps your scene feeling natural. In this video, I'll break down how to create that soft cinematic look using minimal equipment. We'll talk about positioning your key light, incorporating practicals for depth, and how to use natural light to your advantage. And here's a pro tip. The trick isn't just in the lights themselves, it's how you shape and modify them to create a look that's professional yet relatable. Stick around to the end because I'm going to share the one lighting technique that adds life to your shots without stealing the focus from your subject. There are so many ways to look at documentary interview lighting, and it really depends on what you're shooting. I'm going to be looking at a variety of examples with minimal setups, as well as this one, which is a little bit complicated because we're dealing with two subjects here, and it is very hard to shoot a documentary style interview, especially when you're trying to light two subjects and make it look as natural as possible. But before we even get into the setup, we have to understand what we're shooting. This is a conversation between two gentlemen. One is from Sportsnet and the other is a prospect to be drafted for the NBA. And a big thing that they want to play up on is if he's actually ever going to get drafted. So this is going to be a little bit more moody. This is going to be a little bit more mysterious. And we wanted to play up on that. And that is really associated with high contrast ratios. If we look at the difference between this light part of his face to the dark part, it is very heavy. And contrast ratio basically compares the ratio between the light and the dark parts of something specific. If we're looking at his face here, that is his light side and his shadow side. And this could be a 2-to-1, a 4-to-1, and it's just basically comparing the exposures. We're not going to get into specific values here, but this is associated with a high contrast ratio. That is the subject that we're looking at of creating this mysterious kind of narrative, but we also have to look at the space we're in. We are in the basement gym. Obviously, we don't know that, but it is a bit of a dungy training space. And that is what we're playing up on, and that is the location that we had provided for us. A lot of the times when you're shooting these narrative documentary styles, whether this is a commercial, something that is seen on socials, or it's supposed to be a full-fledged documentary, you're working with spaces that you have and not necessarily getting to choose the best location. So it's usually just working with what you got. And when you're working with two people, this is very hard to do. And in this scenario here, we're going to draw the top down of our room right in the middle. So it's a little bit easier to understand of what's going on. So we have our first subject on the left here, and then our second subject on the right. And we use a technique called cross keying. And at this time when we shot this is one of the first time that Tenfold really worked together as us all four. And we were just really figuring it out on set on what we could actually do. But we all knew that we had to somehow cross key this as having a key light on both of our subjects, but also establish a shadow side. That is always what we're looking to do. This was a 3-interview camera setup. And right now we're looking at the master wide, but we also had tights on our subject. So we have to go into what the basics of a cinematic image is and how to achieve that. And that is always shooting into the shadow side of our subject. So we wanted all the shadow here. That meant we had to place our lights in the background behind our subjects so we could get some light on the opposite sides of their faces here. And you don't necessarily see that in the A camera, but you would mostly see it in the B and C angles. And for our cross key, we were using whatever lights we had at the time. So we had a mixed panel, 150 here, and this was with the stock softbox it has. And on the other side, we had a Forza 500, and this was using a light dome too. So just a dome softbox on that. And then when we talk about the levels of this was sitting at 50%, and then this light dome was sitting at like 30%. We didn't need that much light, but we wanted to use these because it had the softbox on them, and we're only just using one thing of diffusion, so we didn't have that much. But then when you look at this, you can see that there's some sort of light that's coming from over top, really painting the ground as well as giving us a center point to look at. And then when you even look at the top of his head, there's some sort of softness and top light that's coming across that highlights the high parts of the face. So that would be the nose, the forehead, the tops of the ears, the eyebrows. So there is some sort of top light coming in here, and that is right here. And then we had 2 nanlite pavo tubes overhead, and these were sitting at 100%, but that was going through a scrim gym. And that scrim gym had 2 layers of diffusion. So if I draw this further, that it's going through something, and it's made by Westcott. And what scrim gym is, I don't exactly know the dimensions of this one. I believe it's like 4 feet by 3 feet. And it's a really compact setup that allows you to get a diffusion frame. And this is what we started with, and we still use this to this day. and it comes with a 1 stop and then a 1.5 stop of diffusion. And then it just Velcros onto the edges and it's really easy to set up. And the only problem is it just gets dirty really easily and because it's just getting thrown all around. But we like to use this in our travel kit because it's just a long thing that we can break down and use anytime, as well as then we just have diffusion on us all the time. We're using both stops of diffusion here to give us a 2.5 stop. So this is spreading that light all over the place, as well as giving us this soft top light. And then we have some details in the background here, if you noticed. And then also a little tube down here. So this is a smaller pavo tube. I don't even know the name, but it's the really small foot one, which is 1 foot. And then we have that set at 2700 Kelvin. And then that is at like 5%, just to give us a little bit interest in the background, to develop some shadows and everything that's going on here and to add some warmth. And then you can see here that we have this kind of like strip of light. We had that Nanlite 60B with that projector attachment on it. And it's just shooting across here and just giving us a little bit levels right there. And that was sitting at 1% at 2700 Kelvin. And then all my other lights we had set at 5600 Kelvin. And then my camera's white balance, the multiple cameras that we're working with, was set at 4400 Kelvin. And that gives us our natural kind of blue tones, especially to our daylight balanced lights. So when it came to all our key light fixtures, we're really working with the Forza 500. And that is going to be my limiting factor because it is a daylight balanced light. So I am automatically going to set everything to daylight. If I had the mix panel, which was bicolor, and set it to something that was a little bit warmer, it wouldn't give me the same look and something would feel very off. And then we match the pavo tubes to that. So all my key light sources are sitting at that daylight. This is a little bit more of a complex example because we're dealing with 2 people. When you light an interview or especially a conversation like this, you're unfortunately just going to deal with situations like this where you have to cross key and have something else. If you were in a pinch and you only had 1 light, I would say recommend get a panel light and then just wrap a big bed sheet or something out of this. And if you were in a pinch and you didn't have multiple lights, especially what we had, you would just go with 1 source that would be here, biased off to the back, and something that could boom that out overhead. And then you could do this with a panel light if you just wrapped like a bed sheet or some sort of diffusion material and clamped it on the top. That would give you kind of like a lantern or a Chimera softbox. Or if you had a lantern that you could skirt everything off, that would be your best bet. But we wanted to really elevate and use all the gear that we had. So we went with a cross key setup, as well as having that overhead to give us a little bit more ambient. Because if we had another light that we just bounced into the ceiling, it would be spilling everywhere and lift everything. It wouldn't give the mood of the narrative that we're trying to go with. Just remember that context is everything. And more importantly, when it comes into narrative documentaries where you're trying to tell a story, you can tell that story more than with what they're saying. You're supposed to match that as a cinematographer with lighting and composition. And if you want to know more of this framework and the systems that we use to light every one of our commercials, from video work to documentaries to all the commercial work that we do, we released a course called Cinematic Lighting Lab. Check out the link in the description below to find out more. And to talk about this in a little even more, besides the 2-person interview, we also did single interviews, which you can get a little bit more dramatic. And this is some of the shots and B-roll that we got of him just kind of looking around and looking off. And this was something in the interview setup that we had, and we did an entirely different setup where we were just dealing with 1 person. So we could kind of control it a little bit more and really dive into the look that we're trying to hit. And you can again see that this is a lot more dramatic. This is very heavy contrast and the exact look that we're going for. So we still had that scrim gym in play. And if I kind of draw this on an angle, this had that 2.5 stops of diff. And then behind that, we had the Forza 500, and that had the light dome too. And that had a stop of diffusion on it as well. So we're getting a very soft light here, and you can see that on the edge and how it falls off on this triangle going here. But when you look at like the high spots of his face, this is very dramatic, and this is very not sourcey, but it's soft. And that's the exact look that we are trying to go for. So this is just positioning our key light really off to the side to give us enough where we get Rembrandt lighting. So if I were to really draw this setup from a top-down view, it's literally just out of the edge of frame, and then the camera is sitting right here. So this is just getting all this light on the edge, and then because it's so soft, it's wrapping around to him and then just getting on his shadow side a little bit. But because it's such a harsh edge light, it's giving us all this interesting character on his face. And then even we didn't have any black material at the time. This light that we have coming through here is bouncing off everywhere. as well as it's going through the softbox and going through a bunch of different places. So this is giving me my highlight and interest back into the room and lifting it a little bit. But when we look at contrast ratios and when we look at what's brightest, it's the edge light that's going here. And then when we look at what's darkest, it's all the way off to here. So automatically I'm looking at the center of the image, and that is what is most interesting to me. If this fell off into complete darkness, I feel like it would be a little bit too much. We just needed a little bit of that ambient tone back. And luckily enough, we were working in a dark enough space that all that light bouncing back from our key light source was going back up into the room. A lot of people, when they use just a light dome, especially when you put a grid on it, you'll see that the light is a lot more direct and you don't have a lot of ambient tone. So that's why we like to kind of almost triple diffuse our light sources. When we started working with light domes, we like to put a frame in front of that because the light started bouncing back in a bunch of different directions. It just gave us a nicer ambient tone when we were working with minimal equipment. The next set of shots that I want to get into was a documentary that we shot for Quaker. And when we go into documentaries and shooting these pieces, you have to have some sort of consistency. And this goes for framing and especially lighting when we talk about cinematography. So it's possibly having the same key side, or that's not as important, but mainly goes into framing and then choosing proper focal lengths to shoot those documentaries. We shot this on 2 cameras and we had this as a master wide, which we're going to do across all our interviews, as well as have some B angles to cut through during the edit. So if I go to the next shot that we're going to be covering next, that you can see that we have that consistency, but we're dealing with locations where we really couldn't put the key on different sides. But when I swap between these two, you can tell that, there's some sort of consistency, there's some sort of narrative that we're driving forward. And it's mainly looking at the room and establishing, okay, we only have an hour and a half to shoot this interview, and the interview is probably going to be an hour. And that means I only have 30 minutes to really dial in my setup. And our go-to lighting kit when we're especially doing our style of documentary work and interviews, when we have a little bit of set of time, is having a big soft source that we can match and wrap our light around. And that is the Intelitech Mega Light Cloth. But you could use really any source that you want. I'd recommend an Amaran F22C. I am just looking for something that is large and gives me a soft source. Let's talk about our positioning and how we exactly achieve this. When I walked into this room, we were trying to get something that was very natural and spoke up heavy on the space. This is Kevin, our main talent space, and he is doing his master interview here. And I noticed that we had this nice blue couch that we could easily use this for the basically branding of Quaker. It was nice and blue, and luckily that worked for us. But I just noticed that we had this massive window here. So this is my general shooting direction that I'm going to shoot into, because it establishes a shadow that's going to be across this side of the room. And we're always trying to shoot into the shadow side of our subject to give us the most interest, as well as our first line of defense when it comes to giving us a cinematic image. So I have all this light coming in through here, and then you can see that we're working with an overcast day. So this gives me something that is already naturally diffused. So this really played up and really helped me of what we're doing. When we're dealing with a naturally diffused source, we don't have a lot of directionality coming from it. It's not like it's early morning, and if I were to draw this window on a side view, that the light is coming through all this way. This would be like morning or an evening. But when we're working with something that is completely diffused, we have all these clouds here, and that harsh sunlight is coming through. It's giving us light that is coming everywhere and is at a lower level in intensity. And that light is painting down here and not reaching across my room as I would want to. And it's giving me a nice edge light on his face, but I need to bring that around my subject. I need to wrap all that light around here and bring it more into the room. So what we use is I use the Intelitech Mega Light Cloth, and this is a fantastic light because it's nice and big and it is the perfect key light. And we have the 2.0 version, but they just come out with a 3.0 version that solved all the quirks with it. Is mainly that it's a basically bad light to use because of the interface, as well as just cheaply made parts of actually how to hold the frame. Ours is completely falling apart at this point, but we still use it to this day. And in front of that, I actually have a fast frame. The light is already spread out, being a big panel light, and on top of it, it has a set of diffusion. So we are going through one stop here and then also another stop here. So we're working with a total of 2 stops of going through this. And this is basically wrapping that light around my subject and bringing some of it right here and right across my subject's face. We're getting this nice edge light here. And then we needed to lift that even more. And also you can see that tiny catch light in his eye. And that is coming from that IntelliTech. When you think about catch lights, you would think, oh, that's coming from the window. And automatically you're like, a viewer is like, oh, I got a big source in front of it. And that's what they use. But nope, I brought that by wrapping around my subject and trying to match that size. I always try to do that when I have a big source. I try to match it as big as I can with my fast frame. When we talk about that, it's about like a 3x6. And the bigger your light source is, the softer it's going to be, and then the easier it's going to be to able to get that catch light. But the big thing that we're working with here is this fireplace that we see in the background. Even doing a further inspection, you wouldn't catch this automatically. You can see that the fast frame is in the edges of something here. I'm dealing with glass, and glass, besides white walls, is the worst enemy as a cinematographer, because then you start dealing with reflections, and then you have to start using black material to black everything out. And I unfortunately only noticed this in the second part of the interview, where I could see the fast frame and everything entirely in that. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense. This is supposed to be a little dark. We're going into nothingness here, and I can see light. And what I had to do is I had to put something called a bottomer on top of our diffusion frame. If I were to draw out the diffusion frame, it would be like this. And what a bottomer is just putting black material in front of the bottom of the frame, so you wouldn't see it in the reflection. And that was me just taking a 4x5 floppy, leaning it up against it, and then moving on. So this is something I caught mid-interview, and I just asked everybody to pause if we could do that, and it was no problem. And then basically it gave us the black material back here. But again, you can see that edge of that fast frame, and because it's at the edge and then we have some light going across everywhere, it wasn't that noticeable. But to the keen eye, you can see that. But when we look at this, this is a very good interview setup that looks very naturalistic, but also a little bit lifted to give us that cinematic feel that we're always going for. Whenever I do any of my interview setups, I always like to bring that IntelliTech, a big source, as well as something to shoot up into the ceiling if I need a little bit more ambient tone, which you'll see in the next example. And this next example is us shooting an interview in a photo studio to replicate what her house looks like. And this spoke to her and she was aligned with it, so we just had to basically light this space. And again, it's walking into the room and analyzing what exactly you have available to you. And luckily, we had a massive window in the back here with a bunch of shears that were already over the window that we could use to really light this subject as well as light the room. So we already have all this light coming through, and this was shot on a separate day. So luckily, again, we were working with overcast skies, so we had a bunch of soft light coming through here. And then the shears even diffuse that even more. And then you can see that they're this kind of off-white kind of pink color. So this kind of really change the color temperature of it and warm things up ever so slightly. And then our subject is here. My camera is sitting right here. And then we established that same feeling that we were shooting with before of having a wide master interview shot. These are really tough to pull off because you have to light for the wide, and that is one of the hardest things to do. But once you get into these steps of analyzing what exactly you're working with and really amplifying the natural light that's in the space, kind of comes second nature exactly how to light this. And then we had the same kit that we had before. So we have the fast frame, and then we have that IntelliTech Mega Light Cloth. But on top of that, we had to shoot a Forza 500 up into the ceiling to give us a little bit more ambient tone. And this is just to lift the entire room and bring that natural light across the room. Because if we just had that light that is just ever so slightly kicking her out, and then we have the IntelliTech Mega Light Cloth bringing that across the room, and then we have our Forza 500 shooting up into the ceiling, bringing that ambient back into everything so we have proper levels of exposure. When you look at this, yes, you're trying to make it natural as possible, but this is a little bit more clean, a little bit more lifted due to the clientele that we're working with. This is supposed for Quaker, and this was supposed to be content pieces that were going to be showcased on YouTube, as well as Instagram and across a lot of platforms. And more importantly, it's your job as a cinematographer to do research. You're not necessarily going to be like, this is the style of stuff I like to shoot, I'm going to apply it to this commercial. No, you have to be very versatile with the types of scenes and everything that you can light. I came from a world where I love to do a lot of fashion work, as well as a lot of very moody and kind of fast cut sort of things. So very opposite ends of the spectrum. And then as I developed as a cinematographer, it wasn't necessarily what I liked. It was executing on people's visions when it comes to a director and as well as just clientele in general. That's one of the biggest lessons that I learned when it comes to being a cinematographer, is being able to light any scenario no matter what. Not necessarily having a specific voice and doing only things that I like. I like the challenge of creating and evoking emotion based on the visuals that I'm making. And again, as I said, this is one of the most important things that I've learned is being able to light and adapt to any scenario. I hope this helps for your projects that you're shooting, especially when it comes to documentary interviews. And I'll see you in the next video.